You are listening to This is Oklahoma, hosted by Mike Hearn, telling stories of Oklahomans and those that have made it their home.
This podcast is presented by the Oklahoma Hall of Fame, telling Oklahoma stories through its people since 1927. Follow them online at oklahomahof.com and definitely on Instagram at oklahomahof. Let's get into today's episode. What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of This is Oklahoma. Mike Hearn here, your host, back with another episode. Talk to you a little bit about music today, Oklahoma music I can't even speak today. Specifically Oklahoma music, but Brian Gorrell is with me from the UCO Jazz Lab, and which is celebrating, 20 years? That's amazing to look back and think about it. But we'll get to that. I want to talk about your music scene and how you get into it. But Brian, thanks so much for coming down today. Excited to learn about the Oklahoma music scene and for our listeners to learn about it, because it's still early, I think, in kind of the city's history, I would say, in Oklahoma music. But going way back, just chatting to you now, so you grew up in Yukon High School.
I did, yeah. I've been a lifelong Oklahoman, except for a few years that I was out working as a professional musician out of state. And Yukon, in those days, I graduated high school in 1988, so in those days Yukon was still a smaller town, smaller community. And now as the metro has grown, it's sort of like everything is just one big city. It feels more and more that way.
So growing up then, music was always in the house, always around the family? Like what's kind of gets you into music?
So my father, Harold Gorrell, he was a band director, and he actually went to Central State. Back in those days, it was Central State College. It's the University of Central Oklahoma now. And he graduated in 1962 with a music education degree, and went out to be a band director. And as the case was back in those days, he started in more rural areas like Okeen, and then eventually made his way back into the metro area. So when I was born in 1970, my dad was the band director at Yukon High School. And he did that until 1973, and long story I won't go into, but decided that he was going to open a rental store to be an entrepreneur, and from there ended up being a home builder. But music is certainly in his veins, and so from the youngest ages I can remember him playing the piano, having a trombone, a saxophone, a clarinet, a flute, instruments around the house. So I feel really fortunate that environment was there from a young age. So I was just always interested in playing. Piano was my first instrument. So
sat at the piano as a really young kid, just kind of probably on Dad's lap.
Well, yeah, and when I was 7 or 8, he was showing me some things at the piano, and I think I was always stubborn. And so, he had this huge stack of music, and there was a piece that really appealed to me by Scott Joplin called The Entertainer, which is sort of pre-jazz, ragtime, and I really had no business trying to play something like that as young as I was. And my dad, being, educated in a traditional way, said, yeah, you need to wait on that. Well, that was sort of all it took for me to, I'm going to figure it out anyway. And so I think I spent maybe the better part of a year and a half or so tinkering around with it so I could play it, probably with bad fingerings and lots of other bad technique. But I think that was the first piece of music that made me interested in what eventually became sort of a lifelong love with jazz music in particular. But it started with him saying, no, I shouldn't play that yet. And, typical rebellious kid.
So growing up in that, everyone looks back at music in that era, 70s, 80s, it was so good, right?
I think so,
60s, 70s, 80s, like all the stuff my dad listens to that I somehow still listen to today, and how it's evolved to now. Why jazz and not like rock and roll and... because there was a lot, that was kind of big rock period, right? Sure.
And really in the 1970s, my earliest memories of listening to music, my sister, who was 8 years older than me, had this huge collection of 45 records, Some people don't even know what those are, but they're the singles, that have an A side and a B side. And she and her girlfriends, that was what you did in the 70s, is you would go to the record store. And so I ended up playing all those records. And when I think back on it, the rock music and the pop music of the 70s was very sophisticated and incredible harmonies. The musicians were really great musicians. Great guitar players, great keyboard players. So to that end, in high school, I did my share of playing in various rock bands and got to play lots of different kinds of music. I think the love for jazz specifically, I can really trace back to one person, and that's Wayne Kuhn. And Wayne Kuhn was our band director, one of our band directors when I was starting in middle school all the way through high school in UConn. And he had come to UConn in 1980, and he was a trumpet player that had played in big bands and was in a military band. And he was a guy that truly loved this music, but he fostered sort of a culture, and that really is the right word. He fostered a culture at UConn of all of us wanting to do something great, to be really great at something. So every morning before school, when we would go in the band room to put our instruments up, and every day after school when we walk in that band room, there would always be great music playing. So all of us collectively were exposed to Count Basie and the Woody Herman Orchestra and Stan Kenton Orchestra, so many different kinds of big band jazz, because that was his love. And so he brought all this to it. So if you showed up to a rehearsal and you couldn't play a part, and I'm talking when I was 14, 15 years old, you weren't so worried about him being disappointed in you as you were your friends that were sitting next to you. So he truly created a culture of wanting to do something great, of being great at something. And that's something that I've carried with me my whole life. And but it all started right there with Wayne Kuhn. He passed away in 2015, or 2016, I think it was. We had a memorial for him at the Jazz Lab, but it was he was certainly an important person, for sure. Yeah.
That's kind of, I mean, that's probably one thing that people take for granted is, athletes, right? You spend time on a football or a baseball team or a soccer team or whatever it is, and you get that camaraderie. I just neglected to think about, like, you got so many people out there in a jazz band, regardless if you're a marching band or just a band, or you got that same camaraderie. It's exactly the same. You're together, you're practicing, you're spending hours and hours trying to perfect your craft. And like you just said, you don't feel like you've let your coach down. You feel like you've let your teammates down effectively.
It's exactly the same. It really is. And for any young person, whether they go on to a career in music or not, being involved in that is such character building and so important for self-esteem. And all of that, and I see, as a college teacher, I see, continually see a new group of 17, 18, 19-year-olds, and they seem to be getting younger and younger, even though they're the same age. But we get to see really the best of young people, because most of them have been fortunate to come through programs where they have a similar experience. And, that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah. So going through high school, then you're obviously very involved in the scene. In high school, you think, I'm going to go to university, I'm going to play in a marching band or play in a band? And do you think I'm going to go to UCO because I've just spent so much time there? Or do you think, like, OU marching band's amazing, I want to go there instead?
It's so interesting. So like most big schools, marching band is a big part of it. For me and my friends, my group of friends that were really into music, marching band was fun, but it was ancillary to what we were doing. Sure. In more serious music, more artistic endeavors. So it was never, marching band was fun, but it was never something that was important to me in that sense. And by the time I was a junior and senior in high school, and this is something else I would just add, is that Wayne Kuhn and other directors that have created these amazing cultures, one thing they share in common that I've learned is that they're always willing to bring in other people and get help. The directors who suffer are the ones that are worried that they'll look weak if they ask for help. The directors who have the best programs are the ones that are constantly inviting people in and say, hey, clinic my band. What can you tell my bass player that I'm missing to make this better? And it goes on and on. And so because of that, he also helped me to meet so many people in the music community. And one of those people was Larry Skinner. And older listeners that have ever, went and seen live music in Oklahoma, especially jazz, they're going to remember the trumpet player, Larry Skinner. He was kind of a fixture in Oklahoma. Well, he was the jazz band director at Oklahoma City University. And so I met him, and through meeting him, I met another gentleman named Joe Davis, who was an amazing saxophone player, really one of the very best, and he taught at Northeastern in Tahlequah. He was a huge influence. But because of that, my junior and senior year in high school, in addition to UConn, I was already playing in the jazz ensemble at Oklahoma City University. And that was fantastic, meeting all those people. So by the time it was ready to go to college, I was auditioning and looking at lots of different schools. One big one that I almost attended was Berklee School of Music in Boston, and got a nice award that would have helped me to go to school there. But by the time I was a senior, I was seeing the culture at Central State University, which while I was a student became University of Central Oklahoma. And Dr. Kent Kidwell and Lee Rucker, who were my two primary mentors there, they had already built by the mid-'80s an amazing jazz program that was recognized around the country. And some of my friends went there, and as a result of going there, were already networking with the Oklahoma City music scene and actually getting to play. And I was, reasonably smart enough at that point to see that if I went there, I might get similar opportunities. And so that's where I went for my undergraduate degree, was staying here in Oklahoma. And that's exactly what happened. From the end of my first semester of my freshman year, I was able to support myself the entire time I was a student just playing music, which is pretty amazing.
That's amazing.
So, playing every kind of music you can imagine playing in all sorts of different worship bands on Sunday morning, but playing in bars on Saturday night till 2 a.m. and all different sorts of things. So I'm very blessed in that sense that I had the opportunity to play with all sorts of diverse music, pop music and rock and country and jazz and blues and different things. So it was the right move. And Oklahoma City is still that way. That all of our best students find similar opportunities, particularly rhythm section players, to play every weekend or more, 3 or 4 nights a week in some cases. So that's where I ended up going to school, and it just kind of took off from there. And then somehow now it's 2022, and I'm sitting here talking to you about it. I'm not sure how that happened, but it's really been a good deal.
Yeah. So in college, then you realize that, hey, I can make money doing this. Like, this is actually I don't want to go do a business degree and get working 9 to 5. Like, I can actually make money doing this.
I think that from my parents, I got both sides of it, the very practical side of you've got to find a way to make a secure living, and then also the side of follow your passion.
Yeah.
And believing that if you truly love something and you work hard at it, the doors will open. And I tell my students that now, it's not an easy life. There's no guarantees that you're going to go get any kind of music degree and find a good paying job and have good health insurance and all those things that we all need. But, if you're passionate about it and you're good at it, and you work hard enough, I do believe there's always opportunities and doors that continually open. The world is changing. The music scene continually changes. So being willing and able to adapt, I think those possibilities are still there. We have a lot of music majors that become educators that are actually music ed majors, but in Oklahoma, we have the only master's degree in jazz studies. We have the only bachelor of music in jazz performance. So we also have a good percentage of people that truly want to perform.
Yeah.
And so it's been rewarding to watch generations at this point of students and how they found their way. It's never a straight path. It's always, turn left here and turn right there. But the ones that are great at it, that have worked hard, they always find a path. So I could tell you, literally dozens of different stories about how somebody started here and ended up over here. And but they're still doing something in music that they love. So
right. It must be really cool. Just for you, over the 20-year anniversary of obviously, the Jazz Lab, just to look at the alumni and where they are all over the world, right? Because of what you just said, UCO has the only spot, right? The jazz.
Well, there's other schools now that have different.
But only one in Oklahoma, right?
But the only one in Oklahoma that is a true master's degree and an actual bachelor of music in jazz, which carries a little more weight academically, versus a bachelor of arts degree or a minor, those kind of things. So. The Jazz Lab facility that you mentioned that's 20 years old, the facility itself has helped attract a couple generations worth now of new people that really feel ownership of that facility. They see, and it's a unique place. And so the students that are there at any given time, the alumni that we have come back, I think we all collectively feel an ownership of that. And so it's sort of like a sun that so many things revolve around. And that's been great to see.
Yeah, it must be so cool to see that, right? Because been doing it for 20 years, and the Jazz Lab's been going for 20 years, and it's fun to actually see people come through and come back now, and like, this is what it was like when I was here, and now, and talk to the kids and explain.
Well, the teachers are sending their students. We had our 12th annual jazz camp last week, and we had a record number of students participating, so many that we couldn't even hold the camp at the Jazz Lab, so we moved it all into the music building on campus. But we had former grad students, for example, in one case, George Tamayan, that teaches up in the Tulsa area at Metro Christian Academy, and he brought 12 of his high school students, and he's hanging out and teaching at the camp. So we get all that sort of interaction, of people that support what we do. Yeah.
Where does the kind of the teaching element come in for you? Because playing and teaching are two totally different dynamics.
For sure. It's funny because when the Jazz Lab opened in 2002, my first job there, as a full-time person, was building and running the commercial recording studio there, and also teaching some jazz studies. But in my mind, I saw it as a part-time job, because I was still working and playing music 3-4 nights a week. And I had been doing that pretty much my entire adult life. And so I saw it as a supplement in some ways. And don't get me wrong, I loved it, but it was just that. And then about 4 years later, in 2006, is when my mentor, Kent Kidwell, retired. And they converted my position from what was a staff position into a faculty position, and I became the division head for our jazz studies program, working with Lee Rucker. And it started to hit me. Well, maybe this is a little bit more than part-time. But then in 2009, Lee Rucker approached me and said that he wanted me to take over our top jazz ensemble. And that's when it hit me like a ton of bricks. I guess I'm a teacher first and a musician second, but I've always felt like they're equal. And I feel like that anybody that teaches music at a high level has to have performed music at a high level to understand what it takes. And to that end, as far as our students there, we don't care if they are a music ed major or a performance major or a business major that's doing a minor in jazz studies, or an accounting major that's not pursuing any music degree. If they're in our ensembles, we have the same expectations of everybody. And so I think that's the most rewarding thing is passing on that idea that if you learn how to perform music at a high level, you'll know how to teach it. And it's absolutely true. Yeah. And so I think that's one of the differences. Some larger programs, if somebody's a music ed major, they don't have the same expectations of that person. Oh, you're only going to teach. And we just have never felt that way. And that goes back to a culture that was started by, just to mention some people that are important, a guy named Jack Sisson, Dr. Jack Sisson. Jack Sisson was the gentleman that really put music education at Central State University on the map. And that carried on to Kent Kidwell, this idea that excellence is everything and that you don't expect less from somebody for any reason whatsoever. And so it's a place that's almost completely devoid of ego in a lot of ways. It's all about do the work. And so I think that's what attracts a lot of people to our community and what keeps me coming back over and over again.
Well, it works both ways too, right? Because like the kids who you're teaching have a lot more respect for you when they see you on stage, because they're like, oh, he's still doing it, he still gets it, he's still playing to the same crowd, the similar people that I am now playing to. So and also, like you then, it's equal, isn't it? Because you can relate to them a lot more than if you weren't in that position. And I think that should be something that every coach or every teacher or whatever should experience, right? Because there's plenty of people in teaching jobs that don't deserve to be in teaching jobs or have no experience in teaching jobs, but that's a different
different subject.
I don't want to go into that.
Especially it is funny that I've had some amazing students over the years that in many ways I feel like have exceeded what I've done musically, and they're inspiring to me. A guy named Jared Cathy comes to mind that was a saxophone student of mine for his undergrad and master's, and by the time he was a grad student, he was bringing me recordings and saying, check this out, and teaching me. So it ends up being a very much sort of a community effort, and he's showing me things, and now he's working on a doctorate at University of Northern Colorado. And then even my own son that I would mention, Logan Gorrell, he is getting ready to turn 26 this summer, and he grew up around the Jazz Lab. He was 5 years old when the facility opened up, and so he's lived and breathed this music his whole life. And he's an amazing saxophone player. And I can't tell you how proud I am to hear him play. But there's times on the bandstand, like last Friday, we played the final concert for the jazz camp, and he and I stood on stage together, and he plays things that amaze me, And so it's very rewarding, to realize that we're all just on a journey in different levels,
That's special to have that experience with a son, right? Or with with his dad, because I play golf, right? So I get to play golf with my dad, which is one of the very few sports I think that, we can do that. But music is kind of similar to golf, right? You can almost play forever.
Oh, I think so, yeah.
So,
it's always a new experience, just like it'd always be a new course, and the conditions are different. I mean, every time you stand on the bandstand together, and that's part of the beauty of what jazz music is that every time you play, it's something different.
Yeah.
People ask me, what the differences are between playing other styles of music versus jazz, and really the answer is spontaneous composition, improvisation. How you play on any given night is as dependent on who else is on the bandstand and what information they feed you, either inspiring you or maybe not inspiring you. But one thing is for sure, you can play the same song 10 times in a row, and it's always going to be completely different.
Yeah.
And that's what keeps you coming back and over again. I think for jazz musicians is that it's always new. Night after night, if you play, it's always something new. And so to stand on stage with my son and hear him play something that I've never heard him play before, and it's maybe because he's listening to a drummer that's inspired him in a certain way. That's the art of the music.
Yeah.
It really is.
Oh, it's so cool. Love that. The other thing that kind of just looking through your bio, and it seems like that the saxophone is your baby, right? It seems like that is your thing.
I would put piano a very close second.
Yeah.
I think I've achieved, in my lifetime, probably achieved a slightly higher level overall as a saxophone player, but the piano is right there with me all the time.
Yeah.
There's not a day that goes by that my hands aren't on a keyboard. Even if I'm just teaching in my office, I'm playing with my students. And interestingly, in those earlier days we were talking about in the 80s and 90s in particular, I probably overall made more money as a keyboard player that played saxophone than just as a saxophonist, because everybody needs a keyboardist. Like one case in point that's one of the more interesting gigs that I ever played, the year before the Jazz Lab opened in 2001, I had the opportunity to start playing with Ty England. And Ty England, I know some of your listeners will know that name because Ty England was Garth Brooks' roommate in college way back in the day at OSU. And when Garth Brooks got his start in music and throughout the earlier parts of his career, Ty England was his right-hand guy. They co-wrote songs together, so much of that. And Ty England himself in the mid to late 90s had some number one hits. There was a song that was number one on the Billboard charts called Shoulda Asked Her Faster, very much in sort of the Western swing tradition of Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys, but modernized. And so I found myself with the opportunity to play piano for his group, and I did that for about 2 years, and went on some tours. At one point, Garth Brooks gave him one of his old tour buses, and so, and I say old, it was still very nice. So I got the opportunity to be on the road and be in that bus and have those experiences. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for traditional country music and bluegrass and Western swing, because it all comes from the same source. Mm-hmm. It comes from American music, and it's the blues, and it's all interconnected. So I learned so much from that experience about how all different kinds of American music are interconnected. Yeah. So I love all that stuff too.
That must have been so cool to do that, right? To, like I said, live that experience, go on tour, play around, play to different crowds, different cities. And
bigger crowds than you would play for as a jazz artist, for sure. And so it was a lot of fun, for sure.
Yeah. One of the things that, and the other thing, obviously, you showed up on a motorcycle today. That's another big love of yours, which mm-hmm. I want to kind of intertwine, is that what does music and jumping on a motorcycle do for you?
Oh, wow. That's a great question.
Because for me, looking from the outside, it seems like when someone plays a piano, plays a guitar on their own, they're just in their own head and they're free. Same feeling when they're on a motorcycle.
Yeah, for sure. I would say it's interesting you bring that up. So there's two kinds of people that are on two wheels on the road these days. And I don't mean this derogatory towards anybody whatsoever, but there are bikers and there are motorcyclists. And the bikers, it tends to be more of a social activity. Sometimes they're not quite as safe in the decisions that they make, and I'm all about personal choice, whether you wear a helmet or not, all of that. But I put myself in the category of being a motorcyclist. I'm almost over the top with safety. When I came walking in today, I'm wearing a Dainese airbag jacket that is, sort of cutting edge technology. No guarantees, but people that don't ride will ask me, why do you take that risk? And the answer is, well, it's a calculated risk, number one. I'm a very defensive driver, but the sense of freedom of riding on a motorcycle, preferably when it's not 102 degrees out, but is like nothing else. I have some friends that have Bluetooth headsets in their helmets so they can take and receive phone calls, and I just laugh at them because it's like the whole point is to sort of escape. When you're riding on a motorcycle, especially when you're riding safely, you don't think about anything else. Whatever other stresses exist in your life or the never-ending to-do list that we all have, that all goes away in that moment, and all that exists is you and the motorcycle and the road. And it's actually one of the most therapeutic things I've ever discovered. I had the opportunity 3 or 4 times now, and I'm hoping again this summer, I'm not sure if it'll happen, but to go to Colorado Springs and ride to the top of Pikes Peak, for example, on 2 wheels. There's just nothing like that. So how it compares to music, not so much for me, music is much more of a community activity. I mean, I've played a lot of solo piano, for example, at different gigs, play at country club, every week on Sundays. I did things like that for years, but I always prefer to play with others. But when you're doing that, nothing else exists. When you're actually trying to play a solo and you're in the moment, you cannot think about anything else. The highest levels of the music are being in the moment and listening, and without sounding too esoteric, the music tells you what to do. And so you have to be able to clear your mind for that in the same way that you have to clear your mind to be able to ride safely. So I think that's sort of the parallel between music and motorcycle riding.
Yeah.
Yeah. Never been asked that question, though. Well, I like it.
Because I'm not a musician. That's probably why.
No, I think your analogy to sports is fair, too. I think that, that being a part of a team, and that the best athletes are the ones who are not just in it for themselves, that are actually working with a team. I think all those analogies are very fair, for sure. It's athletics and music in a typical high school program are so separated in many cases, and so many high schools are so big these days. But my dad tells stories of sitting down every morning and drinking coffee with the coach, and the band director, and they shared way more in common than they didn't, So it's interesting.
Yeah, talking about the Oklahoma music scene then, and when, like I said, when you were given the job or asked to do the job at the Jazz Lab 20 years ago, and it was all kind of started, and it kind of evolves, obviously, into wow, this is a full-time job now. I'm not just, like you said, you're a musician second, which me as a golfer must have been hard to swallow, because I've always been a golfer first, and now 5-6 years ago I wasn't.
Right, I understand.
But
and really with golf in particular, it's such a fascinating sport because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me as somebody who's watched and putted around with some balls when I was growing up, that the devil is in the details.
Yeah.
Every little small detail matters about how you swing, your stance, all of that, your ability to control not only your emotions, but your breathing and the stroke. I mean, I think there's a lot of similarities, in that kind of discipline as there is in what we're talking about in music.
Yeah, I've never picked up, I think I picked up a guitar once when I was like 12 and thought, I'm going to be amazing. And then it literally was like, what sound was that? And put it right down. But I did recently watch the new Top Gun and thought, I need to learn Great Balls of Fire because Miles Teller did a great job. I can't sing to save my life either, so I have to find someone to sing for me. But the piano bit seems quite hard to do. Great Balls of Fire on the piano. He seemed to figure it out.
It's rewarding, and one of the so many life lessons. But I'll tell one story that relates to it. When I was in college at Central State in the summer of 89, 90, 91, and 92, I was a student, but Kent Kidwell and Lee Rucker and our other teachers hosted the Clark Terry Summer Jazz Camp. So Clark Terry is a name that some people will know and not, but Clark Terry was actually one of the great jazz trumpet players of all time, certainly one of the very best of the 20th century and most influential. And he was an incredibly charismatic musician too, but also a great teacher. He was the first African American ever on a regular network television program. When the Tonight Show very first started, and oh goodness, it was obviously before Johnny Carson. One of your listeners will be able to chime in because I'm not remembering the name, but Clark Terry was the music director on that show, and you know, he was a pioneer in that sense, but his love for the music, he loved to teach and share also. One of the great geniuses, I said, he played with the Duke Ellington Orchestra. He was just exceptional. So at these camps, for me as a young person, to be around some of the legends that were still alive in those days was transformational for me, to say the least. But he had a student big band. There was 200 to 300 students that would participate. They would come in from all over the country for this week-long camp. So I was very fortunate to be in Clark Terry's student big band that rehearsed every afternoon during this camp. And we had come back from a lunch break, and we were supposed to rehearse at 1 o'clock. And Clark Terry was sitting over in the corner of Mitchell Hall, and he had his flugelhorn, he had his back to us, and he was practicing something. And he was playing a very difficult chromatic sounding line, and he played the line and missed something. And anyway, so 1 o'clock gets there, and we all sit there quietly, and he doesn't notice us, and he practices for another 5 minutes. And he finally turns around and sees us, I'm so sorry. And he comes and he sits down in front of us, and he puts the flugelhorn down. Of course, we're watching every move he makes and listening to every word because of his reputation. And he said, you'd better enjoy the process because you never arrive. And that stuck with me. And of course, he's saying, there is no point when you master anything in music. It's just this journey. Some days you win, some days the horn wins. And so that's part of it, is enjoying the process. And I think the appeal for playing the piano or any instrument is finding joy in the process. And so many people have had the experience of taking piano lessons and hating it and eventually quitting because maybe the kind of music they were playing they didn't love, or maybe the teaching style of a particular teacher they didn't jive with. I can picture in my mind the classic piano teacher in the 50s and 60s with a ruler slapping somebody's hands when they play wrong. No, you certainly don't want that. And so finding joy in the process is how people really do stay with it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's totally the same parallel to golf as well, and I'm sure a lot of other sports, because, you're never going to be perfect, but spending hours and hours working on one little detail is going to pay off in the future, and then you move to the next detail, and then you slowly build. But like I said, it's a lifelong,
patience,
journey,
perseverance,
and
all of it,
which builds into amazing life skills too, not just
for sure, yes.
not just playing musical instruments, hitting golf balls. But back to then the Oklahoma music scene.
Sure.
What is when you start, and like what was? Tell me about kind of like that experience of, hey, we want you to come into the jazz lab. This is the goal, and then kind of take me through like those 20 years up to now, because I don't think people realize the scale of how important and how big the Jazz Lab is in Oklahoma music, and then the U.S. country as well. But like, this is your. Don't hold back on telling us about how awesome this place is, because people need to come out and see it. If there's a lot of live music and a lot of opportunities. The city's growing, and people want to. Some business owners might want to have live music on their patio or whatever, and then
sure,
that's just the product of it. But obviously, this starts a long time ago.
I think in order to, and I'll try not to be too long-winded, but in order to understand how the Jazz Lab came to be, it starts just for a brief moment by understanding the history of music in Oklahoma City in particular. If you go all the way back to the teens and the 20s, this was a vibrant music scene here. I mean, Oklahoma City is always set in the crossroads of different areas of the country. It's still personified by I-35 and I-40 and I-44 coming right through the center of the city. But one group, as one example, there was a group that was called the Territory Band in those days, and they would travel around and play. And this was in the 1920s, called Walter Page and the Blue Devils. And the core of Walter Page and the Blue Devils They eventually moved to Kansas City because laws changed there and there was opportunities for live music in the 30s. But that is the core of what became the Count Basie Orchestra. Those very musicians, Lester Young, Walter Page, and others. And so there's a tradition of music in Oklahoma City that I think is a lot richer and a lot deeper than a lot of folks understand. So having just said that, through the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and the 80s into my time, generations of players have been a part of that tradition. And I'm just old enough at this point to have been around some of those musicians that were still alive in the 80s when I started becoming involved in music. And so that's part of the beauty of it. Dr. Kidwell, who was the founder of our modern jazz program at Central, at University of Central Oklahoma, his father was a saxophone and clarinet player that played in those very territory bands. So Dr. Kidwell, all of us that were a part of the program called him Doc. So Doc grew up learning how to play music in his father's band, his father's dance band, where you were playing by ear and where his dad would nudge him or slap him if he got on the wrong harmony on a given tune. So that's part of the practicality of what he brought to the program. The next little tidbit is the reason the Jazz Lab exists is because of a man named Roger Webb. And Roger Webb was the president of UCO. Let's see, he would have come in 1997, and I believe he was still with us. Somebody will correct me on this too. I want to say till 2009 or 2010. No, it was past that, maybe 2011 before he retired. But prior to coming to UCO, he had been the president at Northeastern State University in Tahlequah. And the gentleman I mentioned one time earlier, Joe Davis, was the saxophone guy and the jazz guy at Northeastern and became really good friends with Roger Webb. And Roger Webb loved what he did and what he did for his students. I think his love for him was seeing how he inspired his students, to be real honest. And he helped facilitate a facility in Tahlequah that's called the NSU Jazz Lab. It still exists. It's on Main Street in downtown Tahlequah. It's a much smaller facility than ours, but it's a very, very cool place. And we've had a lot of friends that have taught there and students that went to school there, students that did their undergrad there and came for us for master's degree, et cetera. But so when Roger Webb then came to UCO and saw what Kent Kidwell and Lee Rucker had been building, for the better part of 20 years, I think I want to do the same thing here. So the UCO Jazz Lab was sort of a hybrid thing. So it was a project where it was partially the Edmond Economic Authority, so it's partially the city of Edmond, partially from private donations. A gentleman named Mark Neighbors that owned the land the building was on. He was instrumental in that part of it. And then, of course, the university itself. So they worked on this starting in 1997 from the initial idea until when we opened our doors in January of 2002. So that's when I came along and was actually hired full-time in January 2002 when they opened. And I remember walking into the building with Kent Kidwell and Lee Rucker and looking around, and Doc looked at us and said, "So what do we do now?" I mean, it was an absolute open book of what we're going to do. And Roger Webb, again, was the one that challenged us and said, I want you guys to build a nationally recognized jazz program. At that time, we had no academic degrees in jazz, but we had this amazing facility. And so we started from scratch. And, I was initially the guy that was charged with building and running the commercial recording studio. And from the beginning, I was also teaching different aspects of jazz studies. But really, because of the inspiration of what Kent Kidwell had done, I started working on the academic degrees. So the first thing I added was a minor in jazz studies, lots of paperwork, lots of academic writing. And then in 2006, we added what is still Oklahoma's only Master of Music in Jazz Studies. And going through the process of adding a master's degree, it's like writing a doctoral dissertation. I'll say that. It was a lot of work, and I totally feel like it was worth it, but it was several years worth of work to get the approvals and get it implemented. And that was all really inspired because of what those guys had built for us to make the Jazz Lab have the academic side of it and actually have those degrees. And then after that time, later on, we added our Bachelor of Music and Jazz Performance. So anyway, that's that part of it. From the very beginning, the Jazz Lab was a commercial entertainment venue, open to the public every week. some of the cool things about the Jazz Lab that are still there now is that our friends right next door, Hideaway Pizza, they run their entire restaurant, an outlet of their restaurant and bar in the Jazz Lab any night there's shows. So we have a full bar. Patrons can order anything off of Hideaway's menu. So just picture pizza boxes constantly being walked in, appetizers, all that sort of stuff. So what's great about it is the public can come in, buy a ticket for a show, have a glass of wine, have some pizza, have some pasta, and watch a show. And so that relationship with Hideaway is 20 years strong also, and still going. So the commercial entertainment venue from the beginning, in addition to local talent, and of course jazz music, but all sorts of different styles of music, I think a very fair reflection of the diversity of the Oklahoma City music scene. We have those kinds of artists that perform. And so it's just amazing how it's continued. One thing that we were so worried about is, are the crowds going to keep coming? Because when a place is new, you're going to get a crowd. We had so much good PR at the beginning of it. But 20 years later, the answer is people still show up. And we continually have people that I'll talk to after a show that say, this is our first time here. We can't believe that this facility, this place exists. And so that's the rewarding part of it. I'll mention one other name, David Hornbeek, and a group called the Tres Amigos. That's his silly name he came up with for a group of him and two other guys that got into concert promotion. So the Tres Amigos with David Hornbeek as their lead have been promoting national acts at the Jazz Lab ever since, and we've had so many amazing artists. I mean, I wouldn't even try to list all the names because I'd leave out so many that I would regret. But really a who's who of Grammy Award-winning artists and so many amazing kinds of music at the Jazz Lab. And so, so we that started in 2002. The academic programs came online. The commercial recording studio that I was running was very successful in the early days because, the model for how music was recorded and produced hadn't changed at that point. Since that time, we've watched everything in the music industry be turned upside down. People no longer buy CDs. They hopefully, and I underline hopefully, at least pay for a subscription to a music streaming service. And so even the concept of albums, which we still do, we still produce albums. Our graduate students in jazz studies, their final project for those that do music production is producing a commercially viable album. So we still believe in the album, and we hope that people will always feel that way. But it's changed, so we've changed with it. So the commercial recording studio is now 99% educational facility that our students train with. But everything else is very much the same in the sense that we still have live music and have great shows every week. Yeah. Last week on Thursday night, Edgar Cruz, who's been one of our mainstays for 20 years, did yet another show with a great crowd. And then Friday night was my band with some guests from the jazz camp that we held and had a great crowd for that. And it's just rewarding that people will show up.
Right. And it's not only jazz music, right?
It's every different kind of style of music, rhythm and blues. We have different kinds of rock groups that play. There's some bluegrass that plays. So really just looking at the calendar and seeing what's there, I think people can find something for everybody.
Yeah. And it's 3-4 nights a week?
Yeah, on average, it's at this point, on average, after COVID that hurt all of us, sure, needless to say, but we're still Thursday, Friday, and Saturday pretty regularly at the very least. And then during the school year, there's all sorts of special shows. There's many times during the school year where there's something going on every single night of the week there that the public could come to. Yeah. Whether it's a student performance or a commercial group, there's always music happening.
Yeah, that must be pretty special to kind of been in, and from start to finish and start to now seen that evolution and the constant people come through. And like I said, there's still people coming here that have never been there before. I mean, that speaks volumes, doesn't it? That you're still doing the right thing, right? Not the same crowd keeps showing up.
Yes. One little story, one of my favorite jazz pianists is a guy named Kenny Werner. And so in the early days, I promoted shows on my own too, maybe lost some money sometimes, but we had Kenny Werner to the Jazz Lab in 2004 or 5, and he was talking to our students, and he said, and this is a guy that's traveled the world for decades, and he said, everywhere I go in this country, I get out of the airplane and get in a car and I see the same thing. There's the Applebee's and the Chili's and the McDonald's. And he was basically saying, so much of our country has become corporatized and it's starting to look like a mirror image. And there are a few places in the country that are still unique. And he, said, there is no other place I've ever seen in this country like the UCO Jazz Lab. And that was a very special comment. And I think that's one of the reasons that people come back is because you can't go in any other city and find a facility quite like this one.
Yeah. Outside of kind of obviously the Jazz Lab, there's a lot more music on patios now, and obviously venues that are popping up, Criterion, Jones Assembly.
Yes, for sure.
This is great for the just collective group, fans of music. Mm-hmm. You have a kind of favorite venue that you would like, if someone comes to town, you're like, I'd rather just see them there, or other than obviously your home,
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I would give a shout out to one of our sister programs, and that's the ACM at UCO, mm-hmm. the Academy of Contemporary Music, which their home is down in Bricktown. And ironically, the majority of the folks who teach there are people that are graduates of our program. Chris Hicks and Mitch Bell is just two examples come to mind, really important names there that have been a part of our community. So we're all part of the same community, but they have helped support the indie rock scene, lots of other venues. One of my favorite places that maybe not everybody has been to is called the 51st Street Speakeasy.
Okay.
That's on Western and 51st Street. Yeah. That's the name. And they have all kinds of different music. But for the last couple of years now, on Wednesday night, they have a jazz jam session that's become immensely popular. My son Logan and his friend Kendrick McKinney, that generation of guys that are in their mid-20s now, they kind of run that, and they're introducing the music to a whole new generation of people, and it's such a cool venue. So I really love that place. Interestingly enough, one of the icons as far as live music clubs in Oklahoma City is the Blue Note. And the Blue Note had been closed down for several months for renovations. They've just opened up, and they've supported sort of the indie rock thing for a long time, and now they're also doing a Sunday night jazz thing that I just played at a couple weeks ago, actually. And it's such a neat venue, and it's part of Oklahoma City history too. And I think you feel that. The Criterion, the other places you've mentioned are fantastic. I get the opportunity a couple times a year to play the saxophone with the Oklahoma City Philharmonic. And so just being in the Civic Center and playing in such an amazing venue as that, people don't necessarily realize that the Civic Center's acoustics is one of the very best in the country, just exceptional. And the people that run that venue are all first-rate professionals. And so I love to be a part of that. But there's just so much. That's the great thing about it is there's opportunities to support music. And after COVID, when everything was shut down, I think there is a newfound appreciation for what it means to go hear live music. Because you can listen to music, but there's no substitute for hearing music played live. And it's a social event, whether you're in a more, a more formal setting, like sitting in the Civic Center for a concert, or whether you're hanging out at the Blue Note, having something to drink, listening to some live music on a Sunday night. I think it's all the same, and just want people to get out and enjoy it for sure. Yeah,
definitely. Like for me, I think the first kind of show that I went to post-COVID, if you will, was like at the Tower, and we were sat at tables, and I'd never been to a concert sat at tables, and it was a very odd experience, but I mean, it was Jackie Venson came and played, and I was just sat there, I was like, I'm used to having, because I saw her, first time I saw her was when she opened for Gary Clark Jr. at Cain's a couple of years prior.
Yes, there's an iconic place.
Yeah, and I was like, she was like lighting it up, and I think her story is, I think she did go to that school in Boston and played like classical piano, and then one day picked up a guitar and was like, okay, I'm quitting, I'm gonna go play blues guitar, and now she's a household name in blues.
Followed her passion.
Yeah, so it was kind of fun to see her, but then obviously you get back, and then Gary came and played at the Criterion a couple of probably last year sometime, and seeing him again was like,
well, and you mentioned the Tower Theater, and what another iconic place, and to see how that venue has been reinvented for live music. I think people are hungry for anything that's uniquely part of our history. and so the Tower Theater, is so cool, what we've done in Bricktown, and there's so much live music happening in Bricktown. Bourbon Street Grill comes to mind. It's not Bourbon Street Grill, Bourbon Street something. I'm so sorry for not remembering the name, but they have live traditional New Orleans music every weekend, and my friend Jeff Kidwell and others play down there frequently. And so, it's cool what's happened, how Oklahoma City has literally transformed itself, in the last 30 years or so. And Bricktown is for sure another crown jewel.
Yeah.
With that.
Finishing up then, what are you excited about? Kind of, you don't strike me as someone who wants to stop anytime soon, and you're obviously going to be playing piano till the clock's finished ticking. But what's kind of coming up maybe this year, and then I guess look for the future. What's the plan for going forward?
Wow. So you're catching me here at the 1st of July, and this is usually the 1 month of the year when I take some deep breaths and exhale and then start preparing for what we're doing in the next year. Having said that, there's already a lot of shows that are planned for the fall. I got to think what kind of big exciting things. We have one of the crown jewels in Oklahoma City as far as great musician and artist is my friend Vince Norman, who's an exceptional pianist, composer, arranger, saxophone player. Vince had a career for 24 years with the U.S. Army. He was the lead tenor saxophonist in the Army Jazz Ambassadors, but then later on became a staff composer and arranger and wrote for every kind of music imaginable, whether it was marching bands or choirs or orchestras, all of it. And so Vince is back here living in Oklahoma City Metro, and he has a group called the Joe McCarthy Big Band that he's been a part of on the East Coast. And they're going to come here because he's been involved with a friend that has written an entire jazz suite based on the Nutcracker, but taking all the music from Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker and putting it in jazz setting. And so the weekend, this is just one that's coming to mind, but the weekend after Thanksgiving, on that Friday and Saturday, we're going to be presenting that music to sort of kick off the Christmas season. So very much a modern jazz version of the Nutcracker Suite for 2 nights worth of performances. So
that's awesome.
That one, the trajectory for that is months away, but we're already thinking about it. And we're in the process right now of just booking other national acts and national jazz acts that'll be a part of our season in the fall. I would also give a shout out to a group that I'm the music director of called the Oklahoma City Jazz Orchestra. And the roots of the Oklahoma City Jazz Orchestra really go back to the 70s and 80s, but the modern version was started by my friends and colleagues back 2008 or 9. And we survived COVID barely. Our nonprofit aspect of the group went away during that time, but the group continues on. And so the Oklahoma City Jazz Orchestra represents really a who's who of some of the great jazz musicians in Oklahoma. And we will have 2 or 3 concerts in the fall and 2 or 3 concerts in the spring. And so I would really encourage people to look out for that as well, because it's such an exceptional group of musicians.
Yeah. Well, mate, it's been an absolute pleasure to get to sit and hear you, just share your love about music, jazz music, Oklahoma City music, and just kind of, take us through this journey. I really appreciate it. And for people listening, I'll link your website in the description, and also go to ucojazzlab.com for anything that you want coming up at events. And there's nothing better than eating hideaway pizza while listening to great music.
So I highly recommend the Paradise Pie.
Definitely. I'm sure there's a lot of people listening who know exactly what you're talking about. But Brian, thanks so much for coming down. For people listening, like I said, I'll post the links to the UCO Jazz Lab and then Brian's website as well. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I think Brian's email is on his page as a faculty member. Your email is and contact information is on your UCO EDU page. So
my never-ending to-do list is my inbox. That's right.
Exactly. And,
I'd love to talk to anybody.
Awesome. So thanks so much for listening, guys. We'll catch you next episode. Cheers.
Thanks.
This podcast is presented by the Oklahoma Hall of Fame, telling Oklahoma stories through its people since 1927. Follow them online at oklahomahof.com and definitely on Instagram at oklahomahof.
Thank you for listening. We are inspired by those around us and hope that you are too. Make sure you subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review so we can keep telling your stories. For more great Oklahoma content, follow This Is Oklahoma on Facebook and Instagram.